Hello and welcome to another of Dave's Short Bites. The short bite today is first of a series of short bites looking at the Part 3 form and Part 3 training. Everything I talk about today equally applies to the standards check because the standards check and the Part 3 are virtually identical. The forms are virtually identical, whether or not it's the Part 3 form or the standards check form. So I refer to the Part 3 form. Think of it as a standards check form as well. It's based on lesson planning, and I'm going to briefly go through the subjects of lesson planning. Each of the subjects I will go through in a lot more detail in subsequent short bites. So, lesson planning, quite important, very important. In fact, when I was studying to be a teacher and do my Cert Ed, lesson planning dominated quite a lot of the subject. Lesson planning for me then was about the introduction to the class. It would be about the Q&A, what did we do last week, etc. We would then set the games, the goals of the lesson, etc., or objectives as we were calling them. We would carry out a main body. During the main body we would use resources, various things, etc. We could be talking things like a whiteboard, a blackboard, or overhead projectors, videos, all manner of things, etc., etc. We would end the lesson with a recap, etc., to validate or to be able to clarify what learning had taken place in that lesson. In-car work is no different, absolutely no different, and it never has been. We would start off with an indirect introduction of our pupil. You know, good morning, how are you, how's mum, how's the dog? We would start off with probably a bit of Q&A. What were you wanting to do today, what would you like to do, etc., etc. That would then be based on whether that is realistic or not. So some Q&A on the previous subject. If we're doing roundabouts today, or the learner would like to do roundabouts, do they have sufficient knowledge from junctions to be able to make this a realistic target? And if that is correct, then of course we would then carry on. We would set that aim, we would set those goals of objectives, we would say, right, this is what we are going to do today. Some learners, you maybe know that the be able to achieve a roundabout today would be absolutely fine for them. Other learners, you may be thinking, well, the whole of the roundabout situation might be a bit too much, and so you might decide, you know, for this learner, I'm just going to talk about approaching and turning left at a roundabout, and I would make the goal very specific for that learner so that by the end of that lesson that they have actually achieved something. More about that on the next subject. We need to think about our timings just the same. What are we going to do? You know, how much time do we allocate to each bit? In the old days, we would be doing a Part 3 test, etc., and we would be very concentrating on, we would spend 3 minutes on the recap. We would spend 7.5 minutes boring them to, I'm doing a briefing on the subject, and many trainers spend many hours trying to perfect word perfect these briefings, and you know, you think to yourself, how many times do you actually deliver a briefing in its entirety? Not very often. So the routes are important that we need to choose as well, and again covered in more detail. Often an overlooked thing, although you may be thinking, well, I'm going to do this subject and I'm going to do this area, we often forget the route in between and the things that can go wrong. And talking of things that go wrong, we need to plan for things to go wrong, because anybody who's ever done a standards check or a Part 3 test will tell you things go wrong. Okay, the pupil reverts back to several lessons back to where they can't even seem to know how to check their mirrors or anything, and it is quite a shock for the system for somebody on a Part 3 test, because you are literally sitting there thinking, rabbit in the headlights, what goes wrong? It's a little story on my very first check test way back in 1900 and frozen to death. I took a learner who had failed a driving test, on a manoeuvre, a reverse around a corner. There were 5 or 6 driver faults for other areas, and I thought, well, we'll work on those faults as well. A very mild-mannered girl. She'd never given me any problems before, and I thought this is going to be a walk in the park. When I started to talk about the other things, which are mainly about anticipation, the girl met me with, I don't need to do them. The examiner passed me on all of them. I said, well, the examiner passed you, but you did have some minor faults. I don't need to do them. I just need to sort out my manoeuvre. A little bit disconcerting, sat with an examiner sitting in the back. I was a bit worried, but however, decided to press on. Out of the test centre, right, left turn and immediate right turn to a set of traffic lights and then onto an inner dual carriageway. No mirrors, no signal, no positioning or anything was at all. It was just all over the place. I remember coming down the dual carriageway, literally, what's going on? Trying to compose myself, trying to get back in control. I was talking about we're approaching another roundabout here. What mirrors are we going to use? She just didn't want to play game. It was, I know what I'm doing here. I don't need to worry. Off we went into an area. I had set the lesson goal as we were going to first of all do a bit of work on her planning and anticipation, and then we were going to do a bit of work on the manoeuvre. So I had something to do on the drive there. I pulled the learner over, partly to gain my own control and composure. I then explained to the learner that, look, your mirrors and signals seem to be going wrong. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a session on mirrors and signals and see if we can get them back and then get back on track with the lessons. And she did agree. In the debrief afterward, the examiner told me how to that point it had been brilliant. It was textbook. The girl was obviously giving me a lot of problems. I was able to stay in control of the lesson. I quite rightfully pulled her up. I quite rightly changed the lesson plan, and I said that this is what we're going to do. We are going to now work on the mirrors, and I agreed I was going to do a little bit of prompting there. So 4 marks. Unfortunately, the reality was I then didn't actually do that. Having said that, I then saw a dog running across a field and started talking about anticipation, and then went back into planning and etc, 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 completely not mentioning the mirrors and signal, and of course hoping, of course, that the examiner in the back, of course, will not see any of these. Well, anyway, thankfully in those days, first tests were measured with or marked with an educational. Pupils do go wrong and badly wrong, and every person I've ever spoken to will tell you this. They do. So you need to make sure you plan for things to go wrong, because they will. So what does our part 3 test give us under the subject of planning? First thing, did the trainer identify the pupil's goals and needs? Right, that's the aims and objectives that we've been talking about. It is very specific. You need to mention them. You need to talk to them. Are they relevant for the lesson? If you set goals and aims and objectives, or goals as we refer to now, you can measure them at the end of the lesson. Today we are going to be able to approach roundabouts. So at the end of the lesson you can say, yes, we can measure roundabouts. Scaling is a great way of doing this as well. You know, how confident are you from a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 5, whatever you're using, because again it has that numerical value. You can quantify the learning at the end. Again, remember, these are going to be dealt with in a lot more detail in future sessions. So the next session, was the agreed structure appropriate for the pupil's experience and ability? Well, this is where that Q&A we talked about came into. So you Q&A them questions on the previous subject. What have they done, etc, etc. Do you feel that they're ready for this subject? Have they enough subject knowledge? Have they had enough experience, etc.? So very important there. Was the practice area suitable? Well, we talked about this as well. This is really important. Again, as I said, it's very often that pupils, instructors plan an area and think, yes, we're going to go there. Forget the bit in the middle. We're going to be doing a maneuver over here. And meanwhile, the roundabout is messed up. So when you're planning that area, looking at what you're going to do, and there. And then was the lesson plan adapted to help the pupil work towards the learning goals? And this is what I was saying. This is where we need to make sure that we plan to adapt to the lesson. If you see something wrong, say it, do it, sort it. Say it, see it, sort it. You know, get it done. There's no point in pressing on with roundabouts if the clutch control is gone. So there we have it. So this is a brief thing and an introduction really onto lesson planning on this short bite. In the next sessions, I'll be looking individually at did the trainer identify the learning goals, needs, and in a bit more detail. So bye for now. Have a great time teaching, and I'll speak to you soon.